Chapter 12, in which Oscar gate crashes a dinner party after treading in something wet and nasty, only to find its cabaret leaves so much to be desired that it borders on greed. "We'd only have one chance at it," the Derby said, "and even if we managed," and a wave exploded across the stone to illustrate her point, "we'd be swept off pretty jolly quickly, I shouldn't wonder." But in debating the matter, opportunity passed. To find it again meant turning the boat around. That would throw them closer to the cliffs, unless they moved further out first, which risked their being seen. The Derby cried, "Oh, we could try that!" Oscar stared at where she pointed, but saw nothing. When she changed direction, however, a particularly dark part of the cliff appeared even darker. The Derby raised their chugs and barreled the boat closer, which had Oscar concerned that they now hurtled toward the very rocks they'd spent the night trying to avoid. The sea swelled as they approached and burst across rock. Oscar braced himself to suffer the same, but there was no need, because the waves then lessened, and from open air they chugged into a vast cavern, from dark night into a hollow far darker still. It was high, deep and black within, and only when the Derby lunged at the wheel did they avoid hitting the barge. Slipping along its flank, the two cats felt, rather than saw, its mass. The telescope had hinted at its size, but beside it now, they found the thing was enormous. Neither dared breathe. This den rendered it a monster asleep, the sea giving it a roll of slumbered breath that their own might wake. The engine reduced to little more than idle, they drifted past it until bumping against a rocky ledge of shore. Without a word, they alighted, grateful to find ground again, despite it being the most adverse territory. Beneath their paws, stone was slate-like and cold, and slimy in a way that leaves one unusually grateful for darkness. Ahead, a faint light flickered, and upon slippery paws they crept toward it to find a tunnel leading upwards in a narrow shaft. After their night of dark, its light was encouraging, and they clambered into it, having to crouch in places which the Derby found awkward with her bandaged paw. It opened into a far larger tunnel, almost vertical and hewn with narrow steps. The flickering scattered shadows up its height like bats. Noises were apparent too. Mutterings and scrabblings came from below, with the odd flick of yelp. As the sounds grew, Oscar slunk back into the tunnel, but the Derby peered down, purring eagerly until he pulled her out of sight. Flaming torches appeared, held by two large dogs, and behind them the Purging rose into view. She led an assortment of animals in suits and ball gowns, and trod with a haughtiness that left Oscar wanting to punch her in the face and the Derby to poo all over it. Her guests hadn't anticipated having to clamber up narrow, slippery steps in their best attire, and complained bitterly. When their descent reached a crescendo, the Purging stopped, turned, and hissed that if they didn't shut up, she'd have no hesitation in pushing them all back down again. There were some indignant murmurs, before all continued after her. Behind them, a forlorn and weary Horace followed, struggling up the steps as though allergic to them. And behind him, Sedovitz appeared, climbing magnificently. The cats shrank back, the Derby growled, and Oscar placed a paw upon her. When the troop had passed, the cats edged from the passageway to follow. In time, the steps became wider as the tunnel levelled into a chamber. At its end was an opening through which the entourage disappeared. Left in darkness, Oscar and the Derby hurried after them, stopping at the opening to peer from it. The troop crossed a vast circular hall, dawdling in amazement like a tour group in a museum. Upon reaching its far side, they were herded through a doorway. Alone then, Oscar and the Derby crept from the tunnel to gaze with an astonishment of their own. The hall was vast, so big that it could readily accommodate several standard-size halls with souvenir shops that sold halls. It was empty, other than a sweep of torches around its walls, which struggled to illuminate broad stone arches lost in shadowy heights. The castle was indeed inhabited. "I'm sorry I doubted you," the derby whispered. Not at all, Oscar said, staring in awe. I doubt myself all the time. After hurrying across the hall to the door, the derby looked at Oscar for a plan. He frowned to give the illusion of making one, but couldn't think of anything other than running away and possibly writing a poem about it. Whatever happens, he said, they mustn't see you. They'd recognise you immediately. She nodded. He fluffed his charcoal coat and straightened his hat. However, I might manage to get closer without being noticed. He looked at the door. We have no idea how this whole purging thing is to be played, but we're fortunate the Pajami has invited so many. It might allow me to infiltrate the dinner itself. Again she nodded. With a paw upon the door, he pushed. Nothing moved. He pushed harder. Still nothing. The derby indicated one of its handles then, saying, Doors really aren't one of your strong points either, are they? Oscar said nothing and watched as she turned the handle. Before she had a chance to push, the door was wrenched from her. A large guard dog glowered down at them in a manner suggesting that this was his door and he didn't like sharing. Instinctively, Oscar waved. The dog did not wave back. Right, Oscar said, blinking up at him. Sorry, but we got distracted by the hall's splendour and hadn't realised the others had already left. Although the glower remained, the dog stood aside. With a glance at each other, Oscar and the derby trotted past him to find themselves in a corridor. In it, stench assaulted them in a manner akin to pleurisy. With paws shoved across their faces, the two cats retched. Was that you? Oscar swore, but she didn't reply, convinced her throat now had holes in it. At the corridor's far end was another door, which they hurried toward before their eyes stopped working. When they collapsed against it, they heard muffled murmurs of conversation beyond, suggesting air far better than the sweaty cheese they breathed. Holding their breath, which was a bit like not swallowing cheese, they pushed through it and spilled into an enormous dining hall. Unlike the hall they'd arrived in, this one was not dark, bare stone, but instead an impressive and grand statement. Upon its walls hung tapestries and rugs that cascaded across the floor in quite unnecessary opulence. A huge fire burnt in a hearth, only marginally larger than the flames it contained, which, along with torches around its perimeter, bathed the place in a most agreeable amber warmth. At the hall's centre was an extraordinary expanse of polished table, around which the entourage settled in tall chairs. Oscar indicated a doorway a distance away, and the derby darted around the table to disappear through it. Squeezing himself in amongst those jostling, Oscar muttered about things he imagined any austere resident of Ruen would need to. Manure on walls, for example, and the state of Ruen's hotels. He peered at them from beneath his brim. Their mood had improved, to some degree at least, finding this hall more befitting their status and attire than the climb getting to it. All, that is, except one. Some chairs away Horace sat. Having lost his monocle, he stared gloomily, ignoring his neighbour's frivolities. But before Oscar could offer any hope, he spied that horrid, grey and ancient animal at the table's far end. Both horrid animals, actually, because sitting beside the Pajami was Sedovitz Tapanu, who smiled at his audience with a smugness complementing hers of conceit. It was clear then, the two animals were in collusion. The Pajami stood and clapped her paws once. The door that the derby had disappeared through opened, and from it a chef strode. He was followed by a train of waiters, struggling beneath piles of steaming dishes. With a clumsiness bordering on farce, the meals of food were distributed around the table in a manner suggesting their being waiters was an intentional play on words. Several plates ended up on the floor, accompanied by expletives from those responsible, one of whom tried for reprieve by suggesting that's how castle feasts were traditionally conducted, with tables being a more recent invention. No guest believed him, though one gave him a smattering of applause for trying. Several more meals of food ended up on the floor when subsequent waiters tripped over the first lot, and when the Pajami hissed at the chef that obviously more meals were required, waiters left to fetch them. along with sponges and sticking plaster. To distract from the farce, the Purging addressed her guests. "My friends," she began, "you are the first animals to dine within this splendid hall for over 1,000 years. This is a privilege I ask you to reflect upon in the light of what I shall shortly reveal." A large dog with big lips raised a paw when a dish was placed before him. I don't like fish." "It's not fish, it's chicken," the Purging said. "Are you certain? It looks like fish to me." "You know what? In lieu of what I'm about to reveal, I really don't care. Either eat it or don't eat it. Regardless, I'm not interested." The dog peered at his neighbour's meal. "Is that fish?" The animal slurped, shook his head, and advised it was chicken. The dog with big lips thought for a moment before asking, "Do you like fish?" His neighbour shrugged that he wasn't fast. "Do you want my fish?" the big-lipped dog asked. His neighbour took the dog's plate and scraped it onto his, after which he continued in a sort of double-barreled slurping. The big-lipped dog stared at him before advising that there'd been a misunderstanding. His inquiry was based on exchange rather than addition. But because his neighbour was about as interested as the Purging, the slurping continued. The big-lipped dog fumed. His neighbour now had 2 meals, chicken and fish. Had he known things were going to work out this way, he'd probably have had the fish. So he asked of any who might care, "Is there any more chicken?" And after a moment added, "Or any fish?" "Enough!" screamed the Purging. Every animal jumped, and a plate smashed in the kitchen. There was silence then, but for the roaring fire, which seemed to emanate from her. She glared at them. Having waited years for this moment, she decided to dispense with rehearsed choreography. Her genius deserved a certain spontaneity. With several breaths, the Purging forced herself calm. She intended to savour this moment, this razored edge. After this, Ruen would return to what it once was. Theirs. A city not shared because there were no young animals to share it with. She wanted Ruen back. She wanted her time again. This wasn't political. Oh no, this was personal. She hated every last one of those young, carefree animals for the simple reason that she was no longer one. It was envy. Nothing more. Nothing less. And perhaps a bit of greed. But nothing else. Although one couldn't discount her sociopathic bitterness, or indeed her narcissism, or her conceit, vanity, and pathological acrimony for that matter. Nevertheless, envy was her main motivator. "My fellow inhabitants of Ruen," she said, raising her withered arms in communal embrace. "For too long we have struggled under the turgid weight of creatures wishing to break Ruen. For too long have we stood by to watch our beloved city be dragged from its quiet beauty into a cesspit of stinking hell." Her audience blinked, having no idea what she was on about. None of them dared ask, nor did they dare move, except to swallow a bit of chicken, or fish, which was done cautiously. "However," she continued, basking in a misconstrued solidarity, "I have brought you all here to witness a means to turn back time, a means to return our beloved city to the way it once was, free of those pesky little runts." There were uncomfortable looks exchanged between many. "A means to purge their slow, cancerous invasion of our walls." And the odd, unintentional squelch of swallow. "Never again, my dear friends, will we have to resist the impudent, insolent, and disrespectful filth so liberally cast upon our walls, or indeed detonated in our streets." Such a farce became too much for Horace, who stood and yelled, "You, sir, may indeed have my fish." The Purging, stunned, stopped. Complete silence fell. Even the fire burned uncomfortably. "You, sir, may have my fish," he said again, pushing his plate in the animal's direction. The big-lipped dog looked at Horace, then at the Purging, and then at Horace again. Opening his mouth to speak, he thought better of it, as verbalizing gratitude did not seem wise just at the moment. In fact, The only thing that seemed wise about the entire evening was not turning up in the first place. The pajami glared at Horace. He ignored her and instead glowered at tapestries to suggest they held far more credence. But the pajami could not digress. Admonishment would only dilute her rhetoric. She tore her glare from Horace. "There are times," she continued, "when situations become so dire that one must do away with consultation. There are times when only the genius of a single mind will suffice." She put a paw to her chest to prove her humility. "At such a dire hour, one must travel far from the corruptive mediocrity of others to a place where solitude can give birth to brilliance, because genius can only ever be realized alone." While the pajami was engrossed in her theatrical rubbish, Oscar tried for Horace's attention by blinking violently at him. But the dog remained unawares, his indignation mounting with every self-infatuated syllable spewed. The pajami gestured to Sedovitz, who stood and moved to one side of the fireplace, where he waited magnificently. "This night," she said, "Ruen shall be purged of such contamination, for in this castle's courtyard wait 13 superbly crafted catapults, each loaded with 15,000 cubic paws of the most caustic and revolting disinfectant ever made, a disinfectant brewed here in the depths of this castle's volcanic bowels." She threw her paws high and flexed her claws in razored show. "When launched, they will cause those skulking in our city's walls to be eradicated by their very own medicine." Sedovitz tore a tapestry from the wall. Beneath it, a panel of levers was revealed, including a particularly large one that was almost certainly labelled Purge. A collective gasp rushed around the table, which Oscar added to with several extra syllables, none of them designed for polite dinner parties. Surprised, his neighbours turned to him, including Horace, who, having been convinced the cats had perished at sea, staunched a guffaw of explosive relief. With his prior despondency blossoming into unfathoming resolve, Horace stood and threw his chair aside. Addressing the big-lipped dog across the table, he yelled, "My dear sir, I ask you again, would you like to have my fish?" There was no deathly silence this time, however. Instead, a worried murmur arose as animals sank into their chairs, hoping to dodge the verbal grenade shrapnel. Horace wasn't interested in an answer and turned to the pajami. The greater a distraction he could muster, the greater was Oscar's chance of thwarting this lunacy. The pajami stared at him, her pointy mouth open and eyes huge, her paws still raised, but withering like dying vines. "I would applaud your plan, the pajami," Horace said, "were it not so ridiculous. I have never heard anything so silly. It's no more than a bad joke told badly." He addressed them all then, while pointing at Sedovitz. "This plan is about as clever as that cat organising the horror that befell Hotel de Ruen recently." There was another gasp from the table at the sheer audacity of such accusation. The pajami's disbelief gave birth to torrid rage. "How dare you!" she screamed. "How dare you even begin to fathom what I have undertaken here? How dare you make such "Oh, come now," Horace said. "Surely you don't think I would blame such stupidity on you alone, the pajami?" And he glowered at Sedovitz.